My grandfather was a caretaker at Belmont Park Cemetery in Liberty, Ohio, right outside the city of Youngstown. It was a job my father had secured for him so he could be closer to all his boys, all 5 of them. My father came from a family of 8, 3 girls and 5 boys, my mother an only child. Now my grandfather was a retired coal miner from Welch, West Virginia. He eventually succumbed to black lung in his later years and was laid next to my grandmother to rest at Belmont Park. But that's a few years down the road yet, and not the story I want to tell here. My story takes place in the year of my country's bicentennial. I can still remember all the red, white, and blue stickers, buttons, banners, and flags, plastered, painted, and taped all across my hometown of Liberty. I was 10 that summer, and more than just a little excited about it all. Let's not forget the parade. Like I said earlier, my grandfather was a caretaker, cutting the grass and performing maintenance at the cemetery when needed. We lived on West Montrose. The road was a 90-degree angle and came to a dead end. There was a small trail that ran through the woods at the end of this road and came out at the north end of the cemetery. Now, Belmont Park is an average-sized cemetery, as far as cemeteries go. It sat on a slight grade, with 4 pretty good-sized drainage ponds and 2 huge walk-in mausoleums, which sat at the base of these grades. In the summer, they would open up the huge brass and wood doors and let the air out. My sister and I and some of our friends from the neighborhood, and sometimes even our cousins when they were visiting, would walk down these old musty halls, taking turns reading aloud to each other the names, birth, and death dates etched onto the marble faces. And sometimes, on a dark, spooky summer night, we would sneak into the cemetery with flashlights and take etchings off the older gravestones with crayons and paper. Not to make it sound creepy, but the cemetery was at the end of our road. My grandfather worked there, so it was kind of a place for us kids to hang out at when there was nothing else to do. Not to mention, there were sunfish in these ponds. Now, I would go up and fish these ponds or explore the surrounding woods that the cemetery ran up against, or just sit with my grandfather while he took his lunch breaks and told me stories about my father and my uncles when they were young boys and full of mischief. It was the summer of '76, and I was happy to be out of school. This is a true story, by the way. Now, there had been a bad storm which had gone on most of the night and into the early hours of the morning. By 4 or 5 that morning, the storm had moved on. The day was still gray and overcast, and there was some debris and a few branches that the weather had brought down and blown around, but other than that, it was over. I decided I was going fishing. I grabbed my pole and a few pieces of bread for bait. The sunfish loved it. I made my way to the end of our road, followed the path that led through the woods, and came out at the cemetery. As you come out of the woods, you come to the first of the drainage ponds, which is the largest of the 4 and the best one for fishing. It also had 3 or 4 weeping willow trees around the water's edge that provided nice shade in the summer heat. I walked down the embankment to the edge of the pond, got my pole ready, and began to fish. Now, I had cast my line in several times and was getting no bites. As I had said earlier, there was a storm that had raged most of the evening and into the early morning, and there were some sticks and branches laying around the edge of the pond. Since the fishing was no good that morning, I started to play around the water's edge, snapping off small sections of the sticks and pushing them out into the water, pretending I was launching ships. I had just launched about a 2-foot section of a branch out into the pond, when this hand, yes, a hand, dark and mottled, no more than half of it breaking the surface, had gently stopped the stick and pushed it back towards me. Now, you might think you can prepare yourself for the sight of something that in no way should be there, or to brush up against the unreal. Your ego might get big and say to your conscience that this is how I would react to a paranormal experience. I'm here to tell you right now, when true terror grips you, you're like a deer frozen in the headlights of madness, reeling until your mind finds purchase. Your mind is screaming, no way. Your eyes are saying, right there it is. I came to from my shock as the hand slowly slid under the surface of the water, and the stick was on its way back towards me. At that instant, I realized how close I was to the water's edge, and an entirely new wave of terror swept over me. What if it was making its way to the shore right now, quietly cutting through the muddy storm waters to grab me by my ankles and pull me in? I fell backwards and backpedaled, crab walked up the embankment at 100 miles an hour. I scrambled to my feet and stood there watching the surface where the hand had retreated, but it did not make a second appearance. One sighting was quite enough. I watched as the stick came back and made contact with the shore. That was enough for me. I grabbed my fishing pole and started back towards the trail which led to home, while quickly stealing glances over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I got home, I told my parents what I'd seen at the cemetery, but they didn't believe me, just like most of you reading this right now. It's like anything. I seen a ghost. I seen a UFO. I seen Bigfoot. People look at you, they don't know what to make of your story. But 9 out of 10 times, they just don't believe you. I know what I saw. So many times I've tried to rationalize it over the years, and have tried repeatedly to convince myself that it was just a tangle of sticks, barely submerged under the surface of the water, and that when my branch passed over it, it triggered the whole mass into motion, like some nightmarish Rube Goldberg contraption that assembled itself and caused it to come to the surface for 4 or 5 seconds, and then as gravity took over, it descended and pushed the stick back towards me and gave me this false impression of something being playful with me under the surface of the water that day. I'm in my mid-50s, and I want to put this down before I get too old. Not a month goes by that I don't think about what I saw on that overcast morning in the summer of '76. My children have made me tell them this story 1,000 times on dark nights around our many campfires. So many years have passed since that summer morning, and the man in the mirror is no longer that little boy. Yet the man is still very sure of what his younger self witnessed that gray summer morning. But there's also this little itch in the back of my brain that I can't ignore, that just won't go away, no matter how ridiculous it sounds. That likes to remind me the children's section of the cemetery sits just above my favorite fishing spot. And maybe, just maybe, I had a playmate that day who slid down through the ground to play with me. Who knows? I like to think on bright moonlit nights, when all the conditions are right and the stars are hung just so, they slip out of the sides or base of their rotted caskets, moving like wet eels down these mud tubes, slipping silently into the pond to play with each other, quietly laughing and raising light ripples, scattering the moonlight across its surface.